It began quietly, a phone ringing somewhere in West Virginia, a conversation that should have stayed private. On one end of the line, Eric, a man newly acquainted with the Whittaker family. On the other, a county worker from Adult Protective Services. Their discussion, later leaked online, would ripple across platforms and ignite a new wave of scrutiny around a family that had already been picked apart by the internet. The leaked audio sounded casual, almost mundane. But to anyone who knew the story of the Whittakers, it carried weight. Here was a man who had known the family only a few weeks, maybe a few months, speaking as though he had authority in their affairs, discussing guardianship, custody, and intervention. It raised a question that still lingers. Who gave Eric that power? The Whittakers, a family living in rural West Virginia, became famous when their lives were documented and shared online. Their story fascinated the world. A mixture of poverty, resilience, and raw humanity that viewers couldn't look away from. But with visibility came intrusion. The internet dissected them, speculated about their past, judged their present, and claimed to know their future. They became symbols of something larger, America's obsession with dysfunction. Eric appeared in that world as an outsider with empathy. He offered help, understanding, maybe even a sense of order. But as time went on, the line between help and control began to blur. The leaked calls revealed a side of Eric that unsettled many. In the first call, Eric can be heard discussing the possibility of becoming a co-guardian for Timmy, one of the Whittaker family members. He spoke as though logistics were already in motion, as though human lives could be scheduled in alternating 30-day increments. Maybe like co-guardianship with Patrick, he said, as if the process were as simple as adopting a pet. He could be with me for a month, then Patrick for a month. The words hung heavy. To those listening, it sounded transactional, detached, and naive. The internet reacted swiftly. "It don't work like that for humans," one commentator said, echoing the collective disbelief of thousands. That moment set the tone for everything that followed. The idea that a man could step into a vulnerable family's life and begin negotiating their care as if it were paperwork. It struck a nerve. It hinted at something deeper, the intersection of exploitation, saviorism, and the psychology of control. From a psychological perspective, this dynamic isn't new. When individuals encounter families in crisis, especially ones exposed to public scrutiny, there's a powerful urge to intervene, to rescue. The rescuer often believes they're doing good, but beneath that intent is another motive: significance. Being the one who saves offers validation, status, and emotional power. In Eric's case, the boundary between advocacy and appropriation may have quietly disappeared. The conversation between Eric and the APS worker continued. Listeners could hear both sides speaking with surprising familiarity. The worker appeared to share information that should have been confidential, details about the family situation, internal discussions, and agency plans. It was the kind of exchange that's supposed to happen behind closed doors, between professionals, not between a government employee and a man who had known the family for mere weeks. That breach changed the narrative. What began as concern for the Whittakers now looked like interference. People online asked the same question: how could a county employee disclose private case information to someone outside the family? And why was Eric, of all people, at the center of it? Psychologically, such behavior reflects what's known as boundary collapse, a loss of professional and emotional distance when empathy overrides protocol. The county worker may have seen Eric as a helpful partner, someone passionate about the family's well-being. But in doing so, she crossed a line, blurring the roles of advocate and informant. The next piece of leaked audio deepened the tension. Eric could be heard speaking again, with the worker, frustrated and frantic. "Betty's not here," he said. "Somebody convinced her that I'm on the internet trying to get the family taken away from her. Betty, one of the family matriarchs, had fled to a nearby hollow after hearing that rumor. She was afraid, unsure of who to trust. Eric pleaded with the worker to come in person and calm the situation. "Can you come down? I'll pay your gas. I'll buy you lunch." To the untrained ear, it might have sounded like compassion, but to those familiar with social services, it was alarming. This wasn't protocol, it was manipulation. Eric was pressuring a government worker to make a personal visit on his behalf, offering payment and emotional leverage. The worker agreed. That single moment told a larger story about power and persuasion. People like Betty, overwhelmed by attention and confusion, are often easy to influence. Their boundaries soften under the weight of constant chaos. Meanwhile, people like Eric, who appear calm and organized, can unintentionally or intentionally take control. It's a pattern seen often in trauma-bonded dynamics. The rescuer positions themselves as indispensable. The vulnerable person withdraws, and the cycle tightens. Online, outrage grew. Viewers dissected every second of the call. "He barely knew them," they repeated. "Who gave him the right?" Comment sections filled with accusations, theories, and amateur legal interpretations. But beneath the noise was a collective unease, not just about Eric, but about what his actions revealed about the ecosystem surrounding the Whittakers. The family had become a kind of open case file for the internet. Every stranger with a camera or a conscience felt entitled to step in, to diagnose, to intervene. Eric's calls were simply the latest example of a broader phenomenon. Digital humanitarianism turned invasive. When real people become online property, their autonomy vanishes. Every act of help becomes another form of control. Even Facebook, the platform where much of this discourse unfolded, took notice. Meta's AI-generated summaries began describing the Whittakers, outlining who they were and how they gained fame, as if the algorithm itself had joined the conversation. Entire pages appeared dedicated to speculation and analysis. Supporters and detractors argued endlessly, each convinced of their moral correctness. The lines between advocacy, gossip, and exploitation blurred beyond recognition. Within this chaos, Eric's motivations remain ambiguous. Some defend him, describing him as a man genuinely trying to assist a neglected family caught in bureaucratic red tape. Others see a savior complex, an outsider intoxicated by the attention his proximity to the family brought him. What both sides miss is the psychological truth that both can be true at once. Good intentions and self-interest often coexist. The leaked audio became a mirror reflecting everyone's role in the drama triangle: the victim, the villain, and the hero. Eric positioned himself as the hero, the county worker as the helper, and Betty, along with the rest of the family, as the helpless victims. But as the story spread online, the roles shifted. To the audience, Eric became the villain, the worker the enabler, and the Whittakers the innocent prey. This rotation of moral identity is the essence of the modern digital spectacle. The internet thrives on villains because villains give the audience purpose. Every comment becomes an act of righteousness. Every share becomes a declaration of virtue. And the more outrage grows, the less anyone remembers that real people are involved. Behind all of this is Betty herself, retreating further from trust. Imagine her confusion, a woman already living in a world of noise, now hearing that strangers are debating who should control her family. She withdraws, hides, and isolates. The trauma of exposure becomes another layer of vulnerability. The psychology of betrayal is complex. When someone who appears as a rescuer becomes a perceived threat, it destabilizes the entire emotional system. For Betty, That might mean not knowing who to believe, the voices that claim to help or the silence that promises safety. For Eric, it might mean realizing that his perceived leadership was never invited, only assumed. And for the public, it's another lesson in voyeurism disguised as empathy. As the story unfolded, more names surfaced: Brian, Patrick, BJ, Larry, each part of the web of relationships surrounding the family. Each represented another thread in a narrative that had spun far beyond control. What began as interest in a unique American family turned into an experiment in collective morality, where everyone wanted to be the judge. In the background of all of this noise, the central question remains painfully simple. What does it mean to help someone who never asked for your help? The leaked calls revealed not just a potential breach of confidentiality, but a moral one. They exposed the delicate line between advocacy and appropriation, empathy and ego. And they left behind a trail of consequences, not just for Eric and the county worker, but for the family at the center of it all. As this story spread across Facebook and YouTube, new videos emerged daily. Commentary upon commentary, reaction upon reaction. Pages feuded. Creators accused each other of exploiting the family while doing the same themselves. The spectacle fed itself. In that endless cycle of exposure, the Whittakers became both invisible and hypervisible, a family talked about more than listened to. And at the center of that noise, the voice on the phone, calm and confident, became the symbol of a larger question. Was Eric truly trying to protect Timmy, or was he protecting his own need to matter? The answer, like most truths in this story, lives somewhere between intention and impact. The first recording had barely finished circulating before the second began to surface. Screens lit up across Facebook groups and discussion channels. The words "leaked call," "Eric," and "APS" appeared in comment threads faster than moderators could delete them. The internet had found a new trial, and this time, the courtroom had no judge, only witnesses with Wi-Fi connections. For years, the Whittaker family had lived at the intersection of fascination and pity. Their story, captured in documentaries and interviews, had first inspired empathy. People donated money, sent food, offered prayers. But as the line between storytelling and surveillance blurred, compassion turned into ownership. Strangers began to feel entitled to know everything: where the family lived, who visited them, what they ate. So when Eric's leaked calls appeared, it was as if the audience had been handed evidence in a case they'd been waiting to prosecute. In hours, Facebook pages became digital investigation boards. Screenshots were posted, theories written, audio dissected. Listeners paused and replayed key moments. The sound of Eric's voice, the tone of the county worker, the pauses that hinted at complicity. For many, the revelation confirmed what they had already suspected, that the family had been infiltrated by outsiders claiming to help. Others saw something else: a man overwhelmed by his own good intentions, clumsy but not malicious. Between those poles of outrage and defense, the truth began to dissolve. Psychologically, collective outrage functions like contagion. A single spark, a moral violation, a perceived injustice, can trigger a wave of emotional synchronization. People who have never met a line around anger, they find belonging through condemnation. And the louder the outrage grows, the less the actual facts matter. Within a day, Eric's name was trending inside certain Facebook groups dedicated to the Whittakers. His messages were reposted, his past behavior analyzed. Threads turned speculative. Who was he really? What did he want? Was he exploiting the family story for fame? Each post built on the last, creating an illusion of investigation that was really emotional theater. The internet was no longer commenting on the story. It was the story. At the center of it all were the recordings, two voices speaking in low tones, discussing people who could not defend themselves. The county worker's professionalism blurred into familiarity. Her sentences, soft and measured, implied that she had already crossed the ethical line long before the recording began. In agreeing to share private information, she gave Eric, and by extension, the world, access to something sacred, the inner workings of a vulnerable family's life. What followed was less about procedure and more about perception. Viewers didn't need to understand West Virginia's legal codes to know something felt wrong. They could feel the imbalance. The worker had the authority of the state. Eric had the confidence of someone who believed he belonged in the conversation. And somewhere far from the call, the Whittakers were living unaware that their privacy was being traded like gossip. From a psychological standpoint, this exposure revealed a deeper pathology of digital culture, a phenomenon sociologists call mediated empathy. In this state, compassion is experienced through the act of watching. The more a story hurts, the more real it feels. But that empathy is fleeting. It doesn't end in action. It ends in consumption. People share the content not to solve the problem, but to feel morally awake. For Eric, the allure of that mediated empathy may have been irresistible. He wasn't a celebrity or a politician. He was an ordinary man who found himself in proximity to internet fame. Being part of the Whittaker's story meant being seen, and visibility can be intoxicating. His tone in the recordings, calm, persuasive, confident, carries the rhythm of someone who believes he's doing important work. Yet underneath that conviction is a subtle performance, the savior archetype that modern psychology recognizes as the hero complex. The hero complex often begins with genuine care. The rescuer sees suffering and cannot look away. But instead of empowering others, they step in to control outcomes. They conflate leadership with love, intervention with intimacy. And when their efforts are questioned, they feel betrayed. That dynamic was already unfolding. When Eric complained that somebody convinced Betty I'm on the internet trying to get the family taken away, it wasn't just frustration, it was disbelief that his intentions could be seen as harmful. Heroes rarely believe they can be villains. But for Betty, the situation was different. Surrounded by noise, misinformation, and strangers claiming authority, she withdrew. Her retreat into the hollow wasn't an act of paranoia. It was self-preservation. For someone whose life had been endlessly documented, privacy itself had become an act of rebellion. The leaked calls didn't just damage Eric's reputation. They fractured what little trust the family had left in outsiders. When exposure becomes constant, the human instinct is to retreat into silence. And in silence, the public fills the gaps with imagination, crafting villains, martyrs, and saints from fragments of truth. By the second week, the story had grown beyond its source. Other creators joined in. YouTubers, commentators, and amateur investigators began reposting segments of the audio, each adding their own analysis. One video slowed the tape to highlight a single phrase. Another displayed text overlays of supposed legal violations. On Facebook, long threads dissected the worker's tone, her motives, her likely job title. People began tagging state officials, demanding investigations. The digital courtroom had its evidence, its witnesses, and its jury. What lacked was nuance. In that climate, every participant in the story, Eric, the APS worker, Betty, and the entire Whittaker family, was flattened into archetype. The rescuer became the manipulator. The professional became the accomplice. The family became the perpetual victim. Online, morality is a binary system. It leaves no room for ambiguity. Psychologically, this binary thinking satisfies a need for order. Outrage organizes chaos. It divides the world into good and evil, us and them, helpers and abusers. In moments of collective uncertainty, that simplicity feels like safety, but reality, especially human reality, is never that clean. As the online commentary multiplied, something peculiar began to happen. People started speaking for the Whittakers. Anonymous users wrote statements pretending to be family members, expressing forgiveness or fury. Fake accounts appeared, each claiming inside knowledge. The real family's voices were drowned out by impersonations. The spectacle had consumed its subjects. From an ethical standpoint, this moment marked a point of no return. What had begun as awareness now looked like exploitation, a public autopsy of private pain. It wasn't just Eric who had crossed boundaries. It was everyone watching. Social psychologists describe this as moral distancing. The more people comment on a tragedy, the less accountable they feel for contributing to it. Outrage becomes self-absolving. I'm just spreading awareness, they say, while unknowingly feeding the same machine they condemn. Through it all, Eric's silence became deafening. He stopped responding publicly, but his absence only fueled speculation. In a vacuum of information, rumor became narrative. Viewers debated whether he was being investigated, whether the worker had been fired, whether the family was safe. In the absence of truth, myth filled the gap. Meanwhile, smaller details were lost. How local agencies function, what confidentiality laws actually say, and how overburdened social workers often operate on exhaustion rather than malice. In their fury, viewers missed the systemic truth. One breach of protocol rarely happens in isolation. It happens in systems that rely on individuals to make ethical decisions in impossible conditions. Still, the moral center of the story remained the same: Timmy, the young man whose name kept reappearing in every discussion. His life, his guardianship, his future, all reduced to negotiation in a leaked call. The irony was cruel. In trying to help, Eric had contributed to the very dehumanization the family already suffered. And yet, it's too easy to dismiss him as purely self-serving. Human motivation is rarely that clear. Perhaps he genuinely believed he could offer stability, structure, even love. Perhaps he thought proximity would shield the family from the darker corners of the internet. But intention doesn't erase impact. The leaked audio didn't show villainy. It showed blindness. A man so sure of his righteousness that he couldn't see how much harm his involvement might cause. By the time Meta's automated summaries began labeling the Whittakers as a notable internet family, the story had already metastasized. Other creators were fighting for clicks, repackaging the same material into new formats. It had become an ecosystem, an economy built on outrage, with Eric as the latest commodity. In psychological terms, the audience had entered what trauma researchers call compassion fatigue. When exposed to prolonged distress, empathy starts to erode. Viewers stop feeling sorrow and start craving escalation. They need new shocks, new revelations. The family's suffering becomes serialized entertainment. Through that fatigue, the original question, did Eric betray the Whittaker family for custody of Timmy, turned rhetorical. The answer no longer mattered. The internet had already written its verdict. But beneath the noise lies the uncomfortable truth. Betrayal isn't always deliberate. Sometimes it's the byproduct of people confusing involvement with care. Sometimes, in the pursuit of helping others, we center ourselves instead. As the second week of commentary closed, the threads began looping in circles. Accusations, defenses, moral analysis. Repeated endlessly. The outrage had nowhere left to go. And in that exhaustion, a new realization began to surface among the quieter voices online. If everyone claims to be protecting the Whittakers, why does it feel like no one actually is? By the third week, outrage had evolved into something else. It was no longer just anger or curiosity, it was obsession. Across Facebook, Reddit, and YouTube, the Whittakers' name appeared hundreds of times a day. Entire pages dedicated themselves to decoding every word from the leaked calls, every facial expression in old videos, every rumor whispered by someone claiming to know the truth. The internet had become a self-sustaining machine of commentary. What began as moral concern had transformed into a form of entertainment. People who once claimed to be defending the family were now building their channels, monetizing the story, and scheduling live streams with titles like Eric's Lies Exposed or The Real Guardianship Plan. Psychologists call this phenomenon secondary trauma consumption, when people repeatedly expose themselves to the pain of others as a form of stimulation. It creates the illusion of empathy, but functions more like addiction. Each new revelation delivers a small jolt of moral adrenaline. Viewers feel righteous, informed, part of something bigger. But it isn't healing, it's voyeurism disguised as care. In this environment, truth no longer mattered. What mattered was engagement. The more outrageous a claim sounded, the faster it spread. A story that once centered on one man's boundary violations had become a sprawling digital universe of speculation. Who leaked the call? Who edited it? Who really owned the narrative? At the center of it all remained the family, silent, fragmented, and more exposed than ever. Betty, once the soft-spoken anchor of the household, withdrew further. Her name was mentioned daily, but her voice was rarely heard. Even her attempts to stay private became content. She went into hiding, one post said, as though retreat itself were a confession. For people living under constant public scrutiny, silence often becomes their last form of agency. It is a way to reclaim power when every other form of control has been stripped away. But to the internet, silence reads as guilt. Betty's absence was treated as evidence. Her refusal to engage was reframed as complicity. Meanwhile, the same creators who condemned Eric began to mirror his behavior, claiming to protect the family while using their story for validation. Each post declaring, "We're just trying to help," looked eerily similar to Eric's original justification in the leaked calls. The rescuers had become the very thing they criticized. This pattern fits neatly into the psychological model known as the drama triangle, the endless rotation of victim, villain, and hero. Online, these roles shifted daily. One week, Eric was the villain. The next week, he was framed as a scapegoat. Commentators became heroes until someone accused them of exploitation, and then they too were cast as villains. The cycle fed itself, and no one could escape its pull. What made this spectacle so powerful was the illusion of intimacy. Viewers spoke about the Whittakers as if they were relatives. Betty needs to do this. Timmy deserves better. Larry's the problem. The distance between reality and imagination disappeared. People were not just observing a family, they were rewriting it. The obsession reached its peak when Meta's algorithm began recommending Whittaker content to people who had never even heard of them. Clips of the leaked calls were cut into short segments, stripped of context, and captioned with dramatic music. The family had become algorithmic material, data optimized for outrage. In a strange twist, the very system that had demonetized small creators for sensitive content now profited from engagement around the family's suffering. Every click, every share, every argument generated revenue. Not for the Whittakers, not for justice, but for the platforms feeding on the controversy. Behind the scenes, the real human toll deepened. The county worker reportedly faced internal review, though no official statements confirmed the outcome. Eric vanished from social media for long stretches, resurfacing occasionally to defend himself or post fragments of explanation. Each reappearance reignited the storm. His defenders cited compassion. His critics cited manipulation. The truth remained obscured by noise. And yet, beneath all of it, the psychological themes stayed constant: control, guilt, and moral projection. Eric had sought control over chaos. The viewers sought control over their discomfort. Everyone wanted to be the one who understood. But understanding requires distance, something social media doesn't allow. The closer people looked, the less they saw. The more they analyzed, the more they distorted. The question, did Eric betray the Whittaker family for custody of Timmy, had long stopped being about Eric or Timmy. It became a mirror reflecting everyone involved. The worker who crossed professional lines, the commentators who weaponized empathy, and the audience that confused awareness with ownership. By now, the Whittakers' real lives had been eclipsed by their digital versions. The family was no longer a family. It was a franchise. Their pain had become public property, and their silence the only rebellion left. The internet had crowned itself judge, jury, and historian, but no one was listening to the people who actually lived the story. And that is how outrage becomes obsession, when the need to feel right becomes stronger than the need to be kind. Every storm runs out of rain. Even on the internet, outrage has a lifespan. After months of noise, of uploads and debates and live streams, the Whittaker conversation began to fade. Not because people found peace, but because attention simply moved on. The cycle always does. The hashtag slowed. The Facebook groups fell silent. And for the first time in months, there was space, empty, echoing space, where voices used to shout. It was in that silence that the real story began to emerge. Eric's name no longer dominated headlines, but the shadow of the calls lingered. What they represented could not be undone. A breach of trust, a failure of boundaries, and a portrait of how easily compassion can curdle into control. He had started as an outsider trying to help. He ended as a symbol of the very exploitation he once condemned. Psychologically, this transformation, from rescuer to accused, reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. We want simple stories, good versus bad, helper versus abuser. But real people don't fit into clean categories. The same impulse that drives someone to save can, under pressure, make them dangerous. The same empathy that opens the heart can blur judgment. Eric's mistake was not only what he said in those calls. It was believing that wanting to help was the same as knowing how. As public interest waned, new voices tried to shift the narrative toward understanding. A few commentators began asking different questions. What responsibility does the audience hold? What happens when empathy becomes entertainment? And who protects the people caught in the middle? Those like Betty, Timmy, and their family who never asked to be turned into content. For months, they had lived under the microscope of the internet. Their faces edited into thumbnails, their names in hashtags, their private pain reshaped into talking points. When the noise finally died, what was left was exhaustion. Betty's retreat into quiet was not weakness. It was recovery. Her silence became an act of survival in a world that had made her a spectacle. Sociologists have long warned about the collapse of private life. The way technology erases the line between what belongs to us and what belongs to the world. The Whittakers' story is a living example. Their community, their routines, even their grief became a public performance. When Eric's calls leaked, it only confirmed what the internet already believed, that no one around them could be trusted. Every helper had a hidden motive. Every kindness came with a camera. This culture of exposure is addictive. The human brain is wired to seek resolution, to finish the story, to assign blame, to feel closure. But digital narratives rarely close. They drift unfinished into new controversies, leaving the people involved stranded in the past. For the audience, it's content. For the subjects, it's trauma. In the aftermath, the lesson becomes clear. Public shame doesn't heal, it hardens. It turns empathy into spectacle and learning into blame. The same viewers who condemned Eric for crossing boundaries crossed them again by replaying his mistakes. Each click was a reopening of the wound. But the deeper truth is that everyone in this story was operating out of fear. Eric feared irrelevance, the dread of being on the outside of a story he thought he could fix. The county worker feared failure, that fragile feeling of wanting to help and breaking the rules to do so. And the audience feared helplessness, the discomfort of watching suffering and not being able to stop it. Fear, not malice, drove the entire cycle. But fear, left unchecked, becomes its own form of harm. In time, the story of the leak calls faded into the background of internet history, another moral crisis swallowed by new ones. Yet for those who lived it, the echoes remained. The Whittakers continued to exist beyond the screen, in the same small town, in the same rhythm of ordinary days. They were still there, walking dogs, cooking meals, surviving. But they belonged to themselves again, not to the internet. What remains for the rest of us is reflection. The psychology of this story isn't about one man's mistake or one family's tragedy. It's about the mirror it holds up to us. Why are we drawn to the suffering of strangers? Why do we mistake visibility for value? And what does it say about our collective empathy when compassion becomes content? Maybe the lesson isn't about betrayal at all. Maybe it's about boundaries, the kind that protect dignity, not just privacy. To truly care for someone means to let them exist without ownership, without performance, without expectation. It means listening without recording, helping without narrating, and understanding without needing to be seen doing it. In the end, silence became the truest response. Not the silence of avoidance, but of respect, the kind that acknowledges that some stories are not ours to tell. The Whittakers' lives, once public property, deserve that grace. As for Eric, perhaps his greatest punishment was the realization that good intentions don't absolve consequences. In every voice recording, you can hear sincerity tangled with ego, empathy colliding with entitlement. He wanted to be the one who helped. Instead, he became the one who proved how easily help can become harm. And yet, even in that failure, there is a lesson, one that applies to every person who ever thought sharing someone else's pain was an act of awareness. True compassion requires restraint. True advocacy requires humility. And true healing begins when the cameras turn off. When the story of a leaked calls is finally forgotten, it will not be the outrage that endures. It will be the silence that followed. The moment the world moved on and the family, at last, was allowed to live without explanation. Because sometimes the most ethical thing we can do with someone else's story is simply to stop telling it. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.